A desperate beginning. Rose Harper stared at the eviction notice on her rickety coffee table, her fingers trembling as she traced the bold red letters declaring she had 2 weeks to vacate her apartment. The paper, already worn from repeated folding and unfolding, seemed like the final blow in a string of misfortunes that had battered her for years. Her one-bedroom apartment, with peeling wallpaper and a persistent draft, wasn't much. But it was home, the only safe haven she had after years of struggling to rebuild her life. She sighed deeply and looked around. The room was cluttered but clean, a testament to her efforts to maintain dignity amidst chaos. A single flickering lamp illuminated the space, casting long shadows on the faded walls. Her son's old baby blanket was folded neatly on the worn armchair, a memento of a past life she thought she had left behind. Rose's heart ached with memories of her pregnancy, a bittersweet time when she was filled with hope for the future. Desmond, the man she had loved, had promised her the world. But when she told him about the pregnancy, his promises turned to silence, and he disappeared from her life without explanation. What followed was a storm of heartbreak and betrayal. The painful birth of her son, the doctor's devastating news that her baby hadn't survived, and the lonely years that followed, filled with questions and grief. Now the sting of that loss was joined by the weight of crushing poverty. The small pile of unpaid bills on the coffee table mocked her, a cruel reminder of her inability to provide for herself. Her last job as a housekeeper had ended when her employer passed away, and every attempt to find new work had been met with rejection. As she sat on the couch, her phone buzzed loudly on the table. Rose picked it up hesitantly, her heart sinking when she saw it was Linda, her old friend from church. Linda always meant well, but lately her calls were reminders of opportunities Rose had missed or wasn't qualified for. "Still," she answered. "Rose, I think I found something for you," Linda said, her voice brimming with excitement. Rose sat up straighter, gripping the phone tightly. "What is it?" "The Kensington estate. Yes, that Kensington family. They're looking for a housekeeper. It's a live-in position, and the pay is excellent. They need someone immediately." Rose's heart sank at the mention of the Kensingtons. Everyone in town knew about the family. Wealthy, influential, and notoriously demanding, they lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. "Linda, I don't think." "Don't you dare start doubting yourself," Linda interrupted. "You're the hardest worker I know. Rose, just go for the interview. What's the worst that can happen?" Rose hesitated, her mind swirling with self-doubt. She had no business stepping into a place like that, a world so far removed from her own. But Linda's words struck a chord. What did she have to lose? The next morning, Rose stood outside the iron gates of the Kensington mansion, clutching a folder of references and resumes. Her best dress, a simple navy blue number, was pressed and neat, though it couldn't hide the years of wear. She had spent hours rehearsing answers to potential questions during the bus ride, but now, standing before the massive estate, her confidence wavered. The intercom buzzed to life, and a woman's voice answered. "Yes, I'm here about the housekeeper position. My name is Rose Harper." The gates swung open silently, and Rose walked up the long driveway, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel. The mansion loomed before her, a sprawling masterpiece of stone and glass, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. She paused to take a deep breath before stepping inside, where a stern-faced woman in a crisp black uniform waited. "Follow me," the woman said curtly, leading Rose through a labyrinth of hallways to a small office. "I'm Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper. Let's get started." The interview was grueling. Mrs. Whitmore's questions came rapid-fire, each one more probing than the last. Rose answered as honestly and confidently as she could, leaning on her years of experience as a housekeeper. Her hand shook slightly as she handed over her references, praying silently that they would be enough. "Do you pay attention to detail?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, eyeing her critically. "Yes, Mom. It's one of my strengths," Rose replied. As if to prove her point, she noticed a faint smudge on the desk, and instinctively pulled a tissue from her purse to wipe it away. Mrs. Whitmore raised an eyebrow, but a hint of approval flickered across her face. "You can start tomorrow." Relief flooded Rose, so powerful it left her momentarily lightheaded. "Thank you," she whispered. She spent her first day in awe of the mansion's opulence. Marble floors gleamed beneath her feet, and crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Every room seemed larger than her entire apartment, filled with antiques and treasures that made her afraid to touch anything. As she dusted the library's vast shelves, she overheard whispers among the staff about the family. Rumors about the father's ruthless business dealings and the reclusive life of his young son, Lucas, intrigued her, but she brushed them aside. She was here to work, not to gossip. Late in the afternoon, she was assigned to clean Lucas's room. She stepped inside cautiously, taking in the cheerful space filled with toys and books. On the dresser sat a small silver-framed photograph of a man and a little boy. Rose froze. The boy's features were hauntingly familiar: dark curls, expressive brown eyes, and a dimpled smile. But it was the birthmark below his left ear, shaped like a tiny heart, that made her gasp aloud. Her knees felt weak as memories flooded back. That same birthmark had graced her newborn son, the one she had held for only a moment before the nurses took him away. She reached out to touch the photograph, her fingers trembling. "No," she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. It couldn't be. But deep down, she knew the truth. The boy in the photograph, living a life of privilege under the Kensington roof, was her son, the son she had been told had died. And somehow he was alive. The weight of truth. The mansion was eerily quiet the next morning as Rose stepped through its grand entrance. The sunlight streaming through the massive windows cast long shadows across the marble floors, but there was no warmth in its golden hue. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And Rose's heart was as heavy as the secret she now carried. The truth was too big to ignore. The boy in the photograph, Lucas, was her son, every fiber of her being screamed at. She had spent the night poring over her memories, pulling out every fragment she could recall from the day she gave birth. The dim hospital room, the doctor's grave expression, the nurse's hurried whispers, and most vividly, the brief but life-altering moment when she had held her baby, her fingers brushing the tiny heart-shaped birthmark below his ear. She had been so certain of his death, yet here he was, alive and well, living under another name in a world of privilege. Rose's hands trembled as she adjusted the cleaning supplies on her cart. She felt like an imposter walking these halls, her gaze flicking to every passing staff member, every camera mounted discreetly in the corners. Did they know? Did they suspect what she was hiding? She had to be careful. Her first task of the day was dusting the grand foyer. The massive crystal chandelier overhead sparkled like a constellation, casting prismatic light across the floor. Rose worked methodically, using the time to steel herself. She needed answers, but where could she start? And how could she uncover the truth without drawing suspicion? Her opportunity came sooner than expected. Mid-morning, she was assigned to organize the linen closet near the east wing, the wing reserved for the family's private quarters. The staff rarely ventured there unless explicitly instructed, and even then, only under the watchful eye of Mrs. Whitmore. Today, however, Rose was alone. Her heart raced as she opened the closet door, the faint scent of lavender wafting out from the neatly stacked shelves. She worked quickly, refolding the already pristine linens to bide her time. From her position, she could see into the hallway where Lucas's room was located. The door was ajar, and Rose's pulse quickened. It was now or never. Carefully, she stepped into the hall, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She hesitated at the threshold of Lucas's room, her hand hovering over the doorknob. A deep breath steadied her nerves, and she pushed the door open. The room was a child's dream, bathed in soft morning light that filtered through sheer curtains. A train set wound its way across the floor, its tracks snaking around towers of colorful blocks. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with everything from picture books to early chapter books. A small bed with a neatly made blue comforter sat in the corner, flanked by a nightstand holding a lamp and a well-worn stuffed elephant. But it was the dresser that drew Rose's attention. Sitting on top, next to the same photograph that had stopped her heart the day before, was a small hairbrush. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, her gaze fixed on the strands of dark, curly hair tangled in the bristles. Her son's hair. She had no plan, only instinct. Pulling a small plastic bag from her pocket, a habit from her cleaning supplies, she carefully plucked out a strand of hair, making sure the root was intact. It felt surreal, this act of quiet rebellion, but it was a step closer to the truth. Her hand shook as she sealed the bag and tucked it into her apron pocket. She turned to leave but froze when she heard footsteps in the hall. The sharp click of heels on the polished floor sent her heart into her throat. She darted behind the curtains, the fabric barely concealing her as Mrs. Whitmore entered the room. Rose held her breath as the head housekeeper's sharp eyes scanned the space. Mrs. Whitmore adjusted a few items on the dresser, then turned toward the bed. "Lucas," she called out, her tone soft but authoritative. "Your tutor is waiting. You know better than to be late." The boy appeared in the doorway a moment later, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized sweater he wore. "Sorry, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, clutching the stuffed elephant to his chest. His voice was light and innocent, but the weight of his presence hit Rose like a tidal wave. Her son, her baby boy. Mrs. Whitmore ushered him out of the room, her hand on his shoulder, and the door clicked shut behind them. Rose remained frozen for several long moments, her heart pounding in her chest. When she finally emerged, her legs felt weak, but her resolve was stronger than ever. That evening, back in her tiny apartment, Rose sat at her kitchen table with the bagged hair sample in front of her. Her phone lay beside it, the screen glowing with the number of a private DNA testing lab she had found online. She had spent hours debating whether to make the call, weighing the risks and the consequences. If the test confirmed what she already knew in her heart, it would change everything. But what then? How would she fight someone like Desmond Kensington, a man whose wealth and power could crush her before she even set foot in a courtroom? And what would it do to Lucas to learn the truth about his identity? Tears pricked her eyes as she thought of the little boy she had lost. She had mourned him for 5 years, carried the weight of his absence every day. She couldn't lose him again. Not now, not ever. With a deep breath, she picked up the phone and dialed the number. A calm voice answered on the other end, and Rose explained her situation as succinctly as she could without revealing too much. The receptionist assured her of the lab's confidentiality and walked her through the process. "It'll take about 2 weeks to process the results," the receptionist said. "We'll send you an email as soon as they're ready." "Thank you," Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper. As she ended the call, a sense of calm settled over her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was taking control of her life. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to fight for her son, no matter the cost. The next day at the mansion, Rose noticed a change in the atmosphere. The staff seemed more tense than usual, their movements hurried, and their conversations hushed. Mrs. Whitmore's sharp gaze followed Rose everywhere, making her skin crawl. During her afternoon break, Linda, one of the younger maids, approached her in the kitchen. "Be careful," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Whitmore's been asking questions about you." Rose's heart skipped a beat. What kind of questions? Linda glanced around to make sure they were alone. "She's been asking where you go on your breaks, who you talk to. It's like she's trying to find a reason to get rid of you." Rose forced a smile, though her stomach churned with unease. "Thanks for letting me know. I'll be careful." As Linda walked away, Rose clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't let fear stop her. She was playing a dangerous game, but it was a game she had to win. For Lucas, for herself, for the years they had lost. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, she whispered a silent prayer. Not for herself, but for her son. For the chance to be the mother he deserved. for the strength to face whatever came next. And as sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of the day she would hold him in her arms again, not as a stranger, but as his mother. A battle of secrets. The sun cast long golden rays over the Kensington estate, painting the sprawling gardens with an almost ethereal glow. For most, the beauty of the morning might have been calming, but for Rose, it only heightened her anxiety. The weight of the DNA test lingered in her pocket like a secret she could hardly bear to hold. Each passing day brought her closer to the moment of truth, but also closer to the danger of discovery. As Rose entered the mansion's east wing, her hands gripping the handle of her cleaning cart, her thoughts raced. The previous evening, Linda's warning echoed in her mind. Mrs. Whitmore is watching you. Rose had to tread carefully now, more than ever. Rose's assignment that morning was to clean the family's private library, a grand room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a roaring fireplace, and plush leather furniture. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of richness Rose could only imagine as a child reading second-hand books by a single dim bulb in her parents' small apartment. She moved deliberately through the room, dusting and rearranging books, her mind far from the task at hand. The library, like the rest of the house, was a testament to the Kensington's wealth, but it also held something far more valuable: files. Behind a locked cabinet in the corner of the room lay Desmond's personal records. According to Linda, Rose's stomach churned at the thought of what those files might contain. Could they hold the key to proving Desmond's deception? She hesitated, glancing at the large clock mounted on the wall. It was 9:15 a.m. Desmond was scheduled to meet with his lawyers in the city at 10, and the house would be quieter than usual. It was the perfect opportunity, but she knew the risks. If she was caught, there would be no second chances. Steeling herself, Rose approached the cabinet, her hands trembling as she examined the lock. It wasn't particularly sophisticated, just a standard latch with a keyhole. She didn't have a key, but she had brought along a small hairpin tucked into her apron pocket. It wasn't the first time she'd had to improvise to get by. The first attempt failed, her nerves making her fingers clumsy. She paused, taking a deep breath to steady herself. On the second attempt, the lock clicked open with a satisfying sound, and Rose carefully eased the cabinet door ajar. Inside were neatly organized folders, their labels written in Desmond's sharp handwriting. Rose scanned the tabs: business contracts, financial records, real estate holdings. Her heart skipped a beat when her eyes landed on a folder marked adoption records. Her hand hovered over the file, her breath catching. Could this be it? The truth she had been searching for. She pulled the folder out carefully, her fingers trembling as she flipped it open. Inside were legal documents, each stamped and signed, detailing the adoption of Lucas Kensington. But it was the signature at the bottom of one page that made her blood run cold. Desmond's, next to the words biological father. The papers confirmed what she already knew. Lucas was her son, taken under the guise of an adoption orchestrated by Desmond himself. Her stomach churned with anger and grief as she read through the meticulous lies woven into the narrative. Claims that Lucas's mother was unfit, that she had abandoned him at birth. Lies. Every word was a lie. Rose quickly took out her phone and snapped photos of the documents, her hands shaking as she worked. She had just closed the folder and returned it to the cabinet when she heard footsteps in the hall. Panic surged through her veins. She pushed the cabinet shut and locked it, stuffing the hairpin back into her pocket just as the door opened. Mrs. Whitmore stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes narrowing as they landed on Rose. "What are you doing in here?" she demanded, her voice clipped and icy. Rose forced a calm expression onto her face. "Just finishing the dusting, ma'am," she replied, holding up her cloth as evidence. Mrs. Whitmore's gaze swept over the room, lingering on the cabinet. Rose held her breath, praying the head housekeeper wouldn't notice anything amiss. After a long moment, Mrs. Whitmore turned her attention back to Rose. "Be quick about it. Mr. Kensington values punctuality, and I don't tolerate slackers." "Yes, ma'am," Rose said, lowering her gaze to appear subservient. Mrs. Whitmore left, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as she disappeared down the hall. Rose exhaled shakily, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. She finished her cleaning as quickly as she could, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had uncovered. That evening, Rose sat in her apartment, the photos of the documents open on her phone. She stared at them for what felt like hours, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't enough. Desmond was too powerful, his influence too far-reaching. She needed more, something undeniable, something that would force the world to see him for what he was. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Linda. "Be careful. Mrs. Whitmore's been asking the staff about you again. She suspects something." Rose's hands tightened around her phone. The walls were closing in, and the stakes were higher than ever. But she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. The next day, Rose found herself assigned to Lucas's room again. She worked quietly, her movements precise as she straightened his toys and made his bed. As she reached for the nightstand to dust, her fingers brushed against a small notebook. It was plain and unassuming, the kind of thing a child might use for drawing or writing. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. Inside were simple drawings, stick figures, animals, and scribbled notes in a child's hand. But one page stopped her cold. It was a drawing of a woman with brown curly hair, standing next to a small boy with a heart-shaped mark on his face. "Mommy and me," the caption read in wobbly letters. Tears pricked Rose's eyes as she traced the drawing with her fingers. Lucas didn't know her, but he thought about her. He dreamed about her. The realization hit her like a wave, filling her with both joy and sorrow. Footsteps approached the room, and Rose quickly closed the notebook, placing it back on the nightstand. Lucas entered, his stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. His face lit up when he saw her. "Hi, Miss Rose," he said, his voice cheerful. "Hello, Lucas," she replied, her heart aching with the weight of everything she couldn't say. "How are you today?" He shrugged. "Okay, Daddy's busy again. He said we'd go to the park, but he had to work." Rose's chest tightened. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Maybe another day." Lucas nodded, then hesitated. "Miss Rose, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think my mommy misses me?" Rose froze, her throat tightening as she struggled to find the right words. I think your mommy loves you very much, and she thinks about you every day." Lucas's eyes brightened. "Really?" "Really," Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper. In that moment, she made a silent vow. No matter what it took, no matter how dangerous the road ahead, she would fight for her son. She had lost him once, but she wouldn't lose him again. The battle was far from over, but Rose was ready to face it. She had truth on her side, and a mother's unyielding love. The cost of discovery. The chill of the evening air seeped into Rose's bones as she stepped off the bus and onto the cracked pavement outside her apartment building. The streetlights flickered above her, casting uneven pools of light on the sidewalk. Clutching her purse tightly, she hurried up the steps and unlocked her door, her heart still pounding from the day's events. Inside, the apartment was dim and quiet, but the silence did little to calm her nerves. She set her purse on the counter and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the photos she had taken of the adoption records. Each image was a stark reminder of the deception Desmond Kensington had orchestrated. Every signature, every stamp, every detail was designed to erase her from her son's life. She thought of Lucas, his wide, curious eyes, his soft voice when he asked about his mother. He didn't know the truth, but somehow, in his innocent heart, he felt her absence. The drawing in his notebook had confirmed that much. Her resolve hardened. No matter the cost, she would fight for him. The next morning at the mansion, the tension in the air was palpable. The staff moved quickly and quietly, their usual chatter replaced by hushed whispers. Rose noticed Mrs. Whitmore lingering more than usual, her sharp eyes scanning every corner of the house. It was clear the head housekeeper suspected something, and Rose knew she couldn't afford any missteps. Her first task of the day was to polish the silverware for an upcoming dinner party. She worked methodically in the kitchen, the rhythmic clinking of silver against porcelain calming her nerves. Linda entered, her expression tense. "Rose," she whispered, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "Mrs. Whitmore is watching you like a hawk. She's asking more questions." "I know," Rose said quietly, keeping her focus on her work. "I can feel her eyes on me every time I walk into a room." Linda hesitated before pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "I found this in the trash outside Mr. Kensington's study. It's a list of the staff, and your name is circled." Rose froze, her hand tightening around a polished spoon. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Linda admitted, her voice low. "But it's not good. Be careful, Rose." As Linda left, Rose's heart sank. Desmond was onto her. He might not know exactly what she was doing, but he knew she was a threat. And in his world, threats were eliminated. Later that afternoon, Rose was assigned to clean the family dining room. The long mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier's light, its surface meticulously polished. She worked quickly, her thoughts racing. If Desmond suspected her, she had to move fast. The DNA results were due any day now, and once she had them, she needed a plan. She glanced at the door to the adjoining study, where Desmond often worked. It was slightly ajar, and she could hear his voice, low and commanding, as he spoke on the phone. She hesitated, torn between fear and the need to act. If there was more evidence in that room, she had to find it. Gathering her courage, she moved closer, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Peeking through the crack in the door, she saw Desmond standing by his desk, his back to her. Papers and folders were spread out before him, and her heart skipped a beat when she spotted a familiar folder, adoption records. She couldn't see the contents from her angle, but she knew she had to try. As quietly as she could, she eased the door open a little farther, her pulse pounding in her ears. Desmond's voice filled the room, sharp and decisive. "I don't care what it takes," he said. "I want every detail about her past, every person she's ever spoken to. Find something I can use." Rose's blood ran cold. He was digging into her life, searching for a way to discredit her. The thought of him unearthing her struggles, the eviction notices, the unpaid bills, the sleepless nights spent worrying, filled her with dread. But she wouldn't back down. She couldn't. As Desmond turned toward the window, Rose seized the opportunity. She stepped into the room and reached for the adoption folder, her fingers brushing the edge just as his voice fell silent. "What are you doing?" His voice was ice, sharp and unforgiving. Rose froze, her heart slamming against her ribs as she slowly turned to face him. Desmond's dark eyes bore into her, his expression a mix of anger and suspicion. He stepped closer, his imposing presence filling the room. "I asked you a question," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "What are you doing in my study?" I was just cleaning," Rose stammered, clutching the folder behind her back. "I thought the room was empty." Desmond's gaze flicked to the folder, and his jaw tightened. "Give that to me." Rose hesitated, her grip on the folder tightening. "It's just papers. I didn't mean to." "Now," he commanded, his voice like a whip. Reluctantly, Rose handed over the folder, her hands trembling. Desmond snatched it from her and set it back on the desk, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've been asking questions," he said, his voice cold. "Getting too close to things that don't concern you. I don't know what you think you're doing, but let me make one thing clear. You don't belong here. You're nothing more than a maid. Remember that." Rose's fear turned to anger, her fists clenching at her sides. "I'm more than that," she said, her voice steady despite the tears burning in her eyes. "And I won't let you intimidate me." Desmond's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then he stepped back, his expression unreadable. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Harper," he said. I'd think carefully about your next move." That evening, Rose sat in her apartment, her mind racing. The encounter with Desmond had shaken her, but it had also solidified her resolve. He was powerful, but he wasn't invincible. She had the truth on her side, and soon she would have the proof to back it up. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she picked it up to see a notification from the DNA lab. Her breath caught as she opened the email. "The results are ready." With trembling hands, she clicked the link and read the report. The words blurred for a moment as tears filled her eyes. Probability of maternity, 99.99%. It was true. Lucas was her son. Rose clutched the phone to her chest, a mix of relief and determination flooding her. She had the proof now. But the battle was far from over. Desmond Kensington wouldn't let go of Lucas without a fight, and Rose had no resources, no connections, no allies, except for Linda. She wiped her tears and grabbed her phone, dialing Linda's number. The older maid answered on the second ring. "Linda, I have the results," Rose said, her voice trembling. "He's my son." There was a pause on the other end. Then Linda said, "We need to meet. I have something that might help." "What is it?" "Just come to my place after work tomorrow," Linda said. "It's too dangerous to talk here." Rose agreed, her heart pounding with anticipation. She didn't know what Linda had, but she knew one thing for certain. The fight for her son was just beginning, and she would stop at nothing to bring him home. The gathering storm. The following day dawned gray and overcast, the kind of weather that seemed to press down on the world. Rose stared out her apartment window as raindrops slid down the glass, her thoughts as heavy as the sky outside. The DNA test results had confirmed everything she had known in her heart, but the battle ahead loomed like a mountain she had no idea how to climb. Desmond Kensington had wealth, power, and resources on his side. All she had was the truth, and Linda's cryptic promise of help. She arrived at work early, her movements deliberate as she navigated the mansion's grand halls. Every step felt like walking a tightrope, with Mrs. Whitmore's sharp eyes tracking her every move. The head housekeeper had become increasingly suspicious, and Rose knew it was only a matter of time before Desmond acted on whatever plan he was concocting to eliminate her as a threat. The day's tasks passed in a blur of tension. As Rose scrubbed, polished, and dusted, her mind replayed her confrontation with Desmond in his study. His cold gaze, his cutting words, they had rattled her, but they had also solidified her resolve. He might see her as nothing more than a maid, but she was so much more than that. She was a mother fighting for her son. After her shift, Rose made her way to Linda's small apartment on the outskirts of town. The modest building was a far cry from the grandeur of the Kensington estate, but it felt welcoming, with its cheerful flower boxes and warm lighting. Linda opened the door almost immediately, ushering Rose inside with a sense of urgency. "Come in, quickly," Linda said, glancing nervously down the hall before closing the door behind her. The apartment was cozy, filled with mismatched furniture and the faint scent of lavender. Linda motioned for Rose to sit at the kitchen table, where a pot of tea and 2 cups waited. On the table lay a manila envelope, its edges worn from handling. "I've been gathering this for years," Linda said, sitting across from Rose. "At first, I didn't know why. It just didn't sit right with me. The way Mr. Kensington brought Lucas home, the secrecy, the lies. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Rose's heart pounded as Linda pushed the envelope toward her. "What's in it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I could find," Linda said. "Copies of documents, dates, even photos. It's not enough to win a legal battle on its own, but it's a start. It shows a pattern, one that paints Desmond in a very different light." Rose opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were pages of notes, receipts, and photocopied files. She recognized some of the documents from her own search in the mansion, but others were new. Hospital records, a forged death certificate, and what appeared to be correspondence between Desmond and a judge. This is incredible," Rose said, her voice shaking. How did you get all of this? Linda shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. Let's just say people talk when they think you're not listening. And I've been in that house long enough to know where the skeletons are buried. Rose's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the woman who had risked so much to help her. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, Linda said, her expression turning serious. This is dangerous, Rose. Desmond doesn't just play dirty. He destroys people who get in his way. You need to be smart about this. Gather as much evidence as you can before making any moves. Rose nodded, her resolve heartening. I'll do whatever it takes. Linda poured them both a cup of tea, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. Finally, she said, there's something else you need to know. Desmond's not just protecting himself, he's protecting his reputation. If the truth about Lucas comes out, it could ruin him. What do you mean? Rose asked, her brow furrowing. Desmond built his entire empire on the image of a self-made man, Linda explained. The perfect businessman, the perfect father. If people find out he stole his son and lied about it, well, let's just say he won't let that happen without a fight. Rose stared into her cup, the weight of Linda's words pressing down on her. She had known this battle would be difficult, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it feel even more insurmountable. The next morning, Rose returned to the mansion with a renewed sense of purpose. She had the DNA test results, Linda's documents, and her own growing collection of evidence. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a foundation, something she could build on. Her first task of the day was cleaning Lucas's playroom. The cheerful space was filled with toys and books, and Rose couldn't help but smile as she tidied up. She paused when she noticed a small drawing on the table, a stick figure family, with Lucas in the center holding hands with a woman who looked suspiciously like Rose. Her heart swelled as she studied the drawing. Lucas might not know the truth, but he felt it. Deep down, he knew they were connected. Miss Rose. Lucas's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, clutching his stuffed elephant. Good morning, Lucas, she said, her smile widening. How are you? I'm okay, he said, shuffling into the room. Can I help you clean? Rose chuckled. Of course. Here, you can help me put these toys away. As they worked together, Rose marveled at how natural it felt to be with him. He was bright and curious, asking questions about everything and sharing stories about his imaginary adventures. It was a glimpse of the life they could have had, and it made her even more determined to fight for him. That afternoon, as Rose was leaving the mansion, she noticed a sleek black car parked near the gate. Two men in suits stood nearby, their expressions unreadable. She recognized them immediately, Desmond's security team. Her stomach twisted as one of the men approached her. Miss Harper, he said, his tone polite but firm. Mr. Kensington would like to speak with you. Rose hesitated, her heart pounding. She could see Desmond waiting in the car, his expression calm but his eyes cold. I'm off the clock, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't budge. It won't take long. Realizing she had no choice, Rose nodded and followed him to the car. Desmond rolled down the window as she approached, his gaze sweeping over her with calculated precision. Get in, he said. Rose climbed into the back seat, her pulse racing. Desmond studied her for a moment before speaking. You've been busy, he said, his voice cool. Too busy. I don't know what you're talking about, Rose replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Desmond smirked, a hint of amusement in his expression. You're not very good at lying, Miss Harper, but I'll give you credit for trying. He leaned closer, his tone turning serious. This is your last warning. Stay out of my business, or you'll regret it. Rose clenched her fists, her fear giving way to anger. Lucas isn't your business, she said. He's my son. Desmond's eyes darkened, and for a moment she thought he might lash out. But instead, he leaned back and smiled, a cold, dangerous smile. Be careful, Miss Harper, he said. You're playing a game you can't win. As the car pulled away, Rose stood frozen in place, her mind racing. Desmond had declared war, and she was far from ready. But she wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The storm was coming, and Rose was prepared to face it head-on. The fight for the future. The sky had turned an ominous gray by the time Rose returned to her apartment. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the windows, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of Desmond's veiled threats. She sat at her small kitchen table, the manila envelope from Linda in front of her, and the DNA test results tucked safely inside. The weight of the evidence she had gathered felt both empowering and overwhelming. Desmond Kensington was a formidable opponent, but Rose had something he could never understand: a mother's love and an unshakable resolve. She knew the path ahead would be treacherous, but she was ready. For Lucas, she would face anything. The next day, Rose arrived at the mansion with a new strategy in mind. She had to be careful, subtle, and deliberate. She couldn't risk tipping her hand too soon. Desmond's warning still echoed in her ears, but she refused to let fear control her. Every moment in the house was an opportunity to gather more information, more evidence. If she was going to win this battle, she needed an airtight case. Her first assignment was cleaning the grand ballroom in preparation for an upcoming charity gala. The room was vast, with polished marble floors and towering windows that let in streams of gray light from the overcast sky. As Rose dusted the ornate moldings and polished the crystal chandeliers, she overheard snippets of conversation from the staff. "Mr. Kensington's been in his study all morning," one of the maids whispered to another. "They say he's preparing for something big. Probably another business deal," the other maid replied. "You know how he is, always scheming." Rose's heart quickened. Desmond's study was a treasure trove of secrets, and she needed to find a way inside again. But after their last confrontation, she knew the risk was greater than ever. That evening, as the mansion settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Rose waited for her opportunity. She had noticed that Desmond often retired to his private gym after dinner, leaving his study unattended for at least an hour. It was her chance to uncover more evidence, but she had to move quickly and quietly. With a steadying breath, she made her way to the east wing, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. The door to Desmond's study was closed, but she had learned from Linda that the lock was simple to pick. She slipped the small hairpin from her pocket and worked it into the lock. After a few tense moments, the mechanism clicked, and the door creaked open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the city skyline through the windows. Rose stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She moved to the large oak desk, her hands trembling as she sifted through papers and folders. Financial records, business contracts, and correspondence. Most of it was unrelated to Lucas, but she knew there had to be something. Then she saw it. A slim leather-bound notebook tucked beneath a stack of files. She opened it carefully, her breath catching as she read the first page. It was a journal, and the entries were written in Desmond's precise handwriting. Entry: 5 years ago. The situation with Rose has become inconvenient. She's too young, too trusting. She believes in love, and that makes her dangerous. I can't let her think there's a future between us. Not when she's carrying my child. This will ruin everything I've worked for. I've made arrangements with Dr. Merritt. She'll ensure the baby is taken care of. Rose doesn't need to know the truth. It's better this way. Rose's hands shook as she read the words, each one cutting deeper than the last. Desmond had planned everything. The lies, the manipulation, the theft of her child. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had stolen Lucas and built an elaborate web of deceit to justify it. She flipped through the pages, each entry painting a more damning picture. Desmond's notes detailed the bribing of doctors and judges, the falsification of documents, and his justification for keeping Lucas as his own. He saw himself as a savior, providing a life of privilege for a child he deemed too important to leave with a common woman. Tears blurred Rose's vision, but she refused to stop. She took out her phone and snapped photos of the journal pages, capturing every incriminating detail. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. With this journal, she could expose Desmond for who he truly was. As Rose slipped out of the study, her heart pounded in her chest. The house was silent, but every creak of the floorboards felt deafening. She made her way back to the servants' quarters, her mind racing. The evidence she had gathered was more than enough to build a case, but she needed help. Someone who could guide her through the legal labyrinth Desmond would undoubtedly create. The answer came to her in a flash. Sarah, her friend from church, worked as a legal secretary and had connections with lawyers who specialized in family law. If anyone could help her find the right advocate, it was Sarah. Rose pulled out her phone and dialed the familiar number. Rose. Sarah's voice came through, warm and concerned. Is everything okay? I need your help, Rose said, her voice trembling with urgency. I have evidence, documents, DNA tests, even a journal. Desmond Kensington stole my son, and I need to fight for him. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Sarah said, I'll help you, Rose, whatever it takes. Relief flooded Rose's chest, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small smile. Thank you, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you. We'll figure this out, Sarah said firmly. But you need to be careful. Desmond won't go down without a fight. I know, Rose replied, her voice steady. But I won't give up. Lucas deserves the truth. The storm outside had intensified by the time Rose hung up the phone. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and rain lashed against the windows. But inside, Rose felt a newfound strength. She had faced Desmond's threats, uncovered his secrets, and built a foundation for the fight ahead. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a mother, a warrior, and a woman determined to reclaim what was rightfully hers. As she lay in bed that night, her thoughts drifted to Lucas. She imagined his laughter, his hugs, and the life they could have together. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew it was a journey worth taking. For Lucas, she would fight until her last breath. The storm outside raged through the night, but Rose barely slept. Her mind was consumed with plans, possibilities, and the reality of the battle ahead. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, and Rose felt a renewed determination. The evidence she had gathered was damning, but she needed to act quickly. Desmond's resources and influence were vast, and she knew he wouldn't hesitate to use them to crush her. That morning, Rose met Sarah at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as they huddled over the table, the manila envelope and Rose's phone between them. Sarah flipped through the documents and photos, her brow furrowed in concentration. This is solid, Sarah said finally, her voice filled with both awe and concern. The DNA test, the adoption records, Desmond's journal. This could destroy him. But Rose, you need a lawyer who's not afraid of going up against someone like him. Do you know anyone? Rose asked, her hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup. Sarah nodded. There's a family lawyer I've worked with before, Rebecca Haynes. She's tough, smart, and she's not afraid of a fight. I'll call her today and explain the situation. But Rose, she reached across the table, her hand covering Rose's. You need to be ready. Desmond will retaliate. He won't go down without a fight. Rose swallowed hard but nodded. I've been ready since the moment I saw Lucas. 2 days later, Rose found herself sitting in Rebecca Haynes' office, the walls lined with books and framed diplomas. Rebecca was a tall, no-nonsense woman with piercing blue eyes and an air of quiet confidence. She reviewed the evidence Rose had brought, her expression unreadable. This is a compelling case, Rebecca said, setting the papers down. Desmond Kensington may be powerful, but even he can't argue with DNA evidence and a paper trail like this. We can build a case for custody, but it won't be easy. He'll fight back with everything he has. I don't care how hard it is, Rose said, her voice steady. Lucas is my son, and he deserves to know the truth. Rebecca nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Good, because this is going to take every ounce of courage you've got. The legal process began immediately. Rebecca filed for an emergency custody hearing, citing Desmond's fraudulent adoption and the overwhelming evidence of his deception. The case quickly attracted media attention, with reporters flocking to the courthouse and the mansion. Desmond's polished public image began to crack as the truth about Lucas came to light. Desmond didn't take the accusations lightly. He launched a smear campaign against Rose, painting her as an unfit mother who had abandoned her child. Tabloids ran headlines about her struggles with poverty and her job as a maid, twisting her story to fit Desmond's narrative. But Rose refused to back down. With Rebecca's guidance, she held her head high and shared her side of the story. She spoke about the lies Desmond had told, the grief she had endured, and her unwavering love for Lucas. Her words resonated with the public, turning the tide of opinion in her favor. The custody hearing was intense, with both sides presenting their arguments before the judge. Desmond's lawyers painted him as a devoted father who had only acted in Lucas's best interests. They emphasized his wealth, his ability to provide a stable home, and his love for the boy. But Rebecca countered with the truth. She presented the DNA test, the forged documents, and Desmond's journal, exposing the lengths he had gone to in order to steal Lucas. She argued that wealth could never replace a mother's love, and that Lucas had a right to know the truth about his identity. The turning point came when Rose took the stand. She spoke from the heart, her voice trembling but resolute as she described her journey. She told the court about the day Lucas was born, the lies she had been told, and the moment she realized he was alive. "I spent 5 years grieving a child I thought I'd lost," Rose said, tears streaming down her face. "But he was never gone. He was stolen from me. And now that I found him, I will never let him go again." The courtroom was silent as her words hung in the air. Even Desmond seemed momentarily shaken, his usual confidence replaced by a flicker of doubt. After hours of deliberation, the judge delivered the ruling. Custody of Lucas was awarded to Rose, with Desmond granted supervised visitation. The court acknowledged the trauma Lucas had endured and ordered counseling to help him adjust to the truth about his identity. When the ruling was announced, Rose felt a wave of relief so profound that it brought her to her knees. She wept openly, her heart finally free of the weight it had carried for so long. Lucas was hers again. The transition wasn't easy. Lucas struggled to understand why his world had changed so drastically, and Rose worked tirelessly to rebuild their bond. She left her job at the mansion and moved to a small but cozy apartment where they could start fresh. Linda remained a steadfast friend, helping Rose navigate the challenges of her new life. Slowly but surely, Lucas began to open up. He asked questions about his past, and Rose answered them with honesty and love. She showed him photos from the day he was born, told him stories about her dreams for him, and reassured him that he had always been loved. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Lucas looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Miss Rose," he said hesitantly, then corrected himself with a shy smile. "I mean Mommy." Rose's heart swelled as she pulled him into her arms. "I'm here, Lucas," she whispered. "I'm here, and I'll never leave you again." Desmond's life, meanwhile, unraveled. The court case tarnished his reputation, and his business empire began to crumble under the weight of the scandal. He fought to maintain a presence in Lucas's life, but the bond between mother and son proved unbreakable. As the months passed, Rose and Lucas built a new life together, one filled with love, laughter, and hope. Rose found a job at a local community center, helping other struggling mothers find their footing. She had lost so much, but she had also gained the one thing that mattered most, her son. And for the first time in years, Rose felt at peace.